Please turn your Bibles open to Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5, we'll be reading verses 1 through 11. Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. I'll be reading from the King James Version. And it came to pass, as the people pressed upon him to hear the word of God, he stood at the lake of Gennesaret. He saw two ships standing by the lake, but the fishermen were gone out of them, and they were washing their nets. And he entered into one of the ships, which was Simon's, and he prayed him, and he said, Thrust out thy nets a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people out of the ship. Now when he had left speaking, he said unto Simon, Launch out into the deep, and let down your nets for a draught. And Simon answered and said unto him, Master, we have toiled all night, and have taken nothing. Nevertheless, at thy word I will let down the net. And when they had done this, they enclosed a great multitude of fishes, and their nets brake. And they beckoned unto the other partners which were with them on the other ship, that they should come and help him. And they came and filled both ships, so that they both began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he was astonished, and all that were with him, and the draught of the fishes which they had taken. And so was James and John and the Zebedee, which were partners with Simon and Jesus. And he said unto Simon, Fear not, from henceforth thou shalt catch men. And when they had brought their ships to the land, they forsook all and followed him.
Well, good evening, everybody. You came back. I'm just so happy that you did. That's pretty heavy stuff this morning. When we look at the obligation of what Jesus talks about being disciples, that's a pretty big deal. And you still came back and wanted to hear more, so I'm glad that you've made that decision. It's good to see you here tonight. I've just been really so overwhelmed with the warmth and the friendliness of this church. You've just been so good to me today, and I've made so many connections. I met a lady right up here tonight. Again, I met you this morning, but I met you again tonight. We made a connection because she's related to my neighbor growing up that just lived right over the hill from us. And then I met another lady that knew very well and grew up with someone that in the last church I was a part of had adopted me as kind of her grandson. And I spoke at her funeral a few years ago. I told her she was going to make me cry by bringing her name up because I was so close to her. But just made so many connections. It's a small world. And especially in the church it is. We've got so many connections, and so when you go and you meet with people that love Jesus and are connected in this fellowship, you just make all kinds of connections and you feel like you're at home, and you've made me feel at home. And it's just been a wonderful day with making all of those relational connections. And you've got just such a beautiful facility here. The Lord has blessed you with a great facility, a wonderful, warm, welcoming foyer out there. And you know what? You could play a game of flag football up here. This place is huge up here. I love having a lot of space to preach on because I like to move around sometimes. And so that's just really great too. This morning when we were talking about discipleship, I made a point about that there's a difference between just being a church member and being a disciple. And it reminds me of a story, and I've told this a lot, but I don't think I've ever told it to you because I've never been here, so it'll be new to some of you. Jeremy may have heard this before. But I love this story because it just really points out the difference. There was once a man who went around and he was preaching, back in the old days, preaching these gospel meetings, these revivals from town to town. And he had been from one town to the next. He'd been from one church to the next. And he was starting a gospel meeting. And he preached his first sermon that Sunday, and that afternoon he went home with the local preacher. And the local preacher said, Hey, I just really need your help. There's this guy, and you may have seen him this morning. He was sitting about halfway back in the auditorium, and this guy, he's always at church. I mean, every time the doors are open, he's there. But everybody in this church and in the community knows he's a pathological liar. He just lies about everything. And I just don't know what to do about this guy. I mean, I've tried everything I know how to, and he's not changing. And I just wonder, you as the visiting preacher, if you went and went with me, and we went to make a visit this afternoon to his house, maybe somehow you could say something that would make him change his ways and really embrace being a disciple of Jesus. He says, sure, I'll go with you. So they went to the man's house and made a visit. And so the man, when they get there, sure enough, the man just starts right in on a story. He says, he's telling some things, and you can just tell, the man's got a problem. And so the preacher says, I know how to handle this. He thinks to himself. He says, and the man's name was Bob. He says, Bob, he says, I want to tell you something that happened to me last week when I was in the town over at the other congregation the town over doing this gospel meeting. He said, I'm preaching the sermon, and during the middle of the sermon, the back doors fly open, and this little bitty dog, this little rat terrier dog comes running right down the middle of the aisle, all the way up to the front, and then sits down right in front of me preaching. And he said, right behind him, there's a huge grizzly bear comes running in, chasing right after that dog. And he comes all the way down to the front, and he gobbles that dog right up. And he looks at him in the eye and says, Bob, do you believe that? And he said, I sure do. That was my dog. So, it's just not, you can't get through to some people. It's like, they get the message or they don't. But you're here tonight because you got the message. That God is calling you to be more than just a church member, more than just a religious person. Jesus is saying to you, follow me. Be my disciple. And you're here tonight because you want to take that seriously. Or you're at least interested. I've piqued your curiosity perhaps. And you want to know a little bit more. And I'm glad whatever the state of your journey is, whatever brings you here tonight, I'm glad that you're here. And tonight we want to explore a little bit more about what Jesus says about real life discipleship. So tonight's lesson, I've given the title of Making Disciples, Not Cultural Christians. And our text is Luke 5, 1 through 11. I know you're not going to believe it, but that is our text. And you're not going to believe it because I'm not even going to deal with that text until we get to the very end of the sermon tonight. So the text that was read for us just a moment ago, that is what the lesson is based on, but we're actually not going to turn to it and look at it until the conclusion. And you'll see why when we get there. So let me start this way. Are we right now, witnessing the death of Christianity in America? Last year, Pew Research released a study which showed that there has been a dramatic shift in the religious landscape of America recently. The number of Americans who consider themselves self-identify as Christians dropped 8% in 7 years, Pew Research reported. As of last year, 71% of Americans identify as Christian, while 23% identify as religiously unaffiliated. Now, many people saw that Pew Research study, and it was reported on widely in the media and on the internet, and people began to draw conclusions based upon that study. And some are saying, hey, look, we're witnessing the death of Christianity as we know it in America today. In fact, that's the way it was billed by a lot of news media outlets. Well, actually, what I want to suggest that we are witnessing right now is the death of what might be called cultural Christianity in America. And I think that provides a tremendous opportunity for making disciples. Now let me illustrate it by sharing with you a cartoon that was, found this on a website. It's by Adam Ford. I want you to look at this cartoon. In this cartoon, he's got, all right, at the top, this is America Today. And on the right side, or the left side of the screen, you've got this guy that on his t-shirt, it says non-Christian. And the non-Christian is saying, I am definitely not a Christian. And over here to the right, you've got a guy whose t-shirt says Christian, and then you've got a guy beside him whose t-shirt says, yeah. And the Christian is saying, I am definitely a Christian. Now, when we go to the next panel of the cartoon, you see America 20 years ago. 20 years ago in America, the meh guy in the middle, he would say this: I honestly don't care that much about following Jesus, but it is socially advantageous for me to self-identify as a Christian so that's what I do. It's socially advantageous for me. And so he's over there on the side with the Christian. Now the next panel shows, here's what's happening in America today. The guy over here to the right, the Christian, still says, I'm definitely a Christian. And the guy over here to your right, the Christian says, he says, I'm definitely a Christian. The non-Christian says, I'm definitely not a Christian. So they're still saying the same thing. But the difference is, the guy in the middle, the meh guy, he says, okay, so times have changed. And it's no longer socially advantageous for me to self-identify as a Christian. So I stopped, and I'm on this side now. Look, he moved over from the Christian side to the non-Christian side, and it's all because it's no longer socially advantageous for him to self-identify as a Christian. Now here's what the headlines say, based on the research that we talked about. The guy that's the non-Christian over here, he says, wow, Christian, Pew Research says you're dying over there. There used to be 2 of you, and now there's only 1 of you. You need to be worried. To which then we see the truth in the last panel. The Christian says, no, there really was only 1 of me on this side before, and there's still just 1 of me. The meh guy, he just got more honest. And I think that is really what we see happening in America today. And then he goes on to say, and oddly enough, I feel healthier than I have felt in a long time. Now, I think that really is what is transpiring, what might be called the death of cultural Christianity. How would we define cultural Christianity? I would define it this way. Someone who socially identifies as a quote-unquote Christian, but really does not live their life by Jesus' teachings. That, my friends, is a cultural Christian. And there is a vast difference between that and being a disciple of Jesus Christ. We live in a context today where it gives me no joy to say this, but let's be honest, we live in a context today where cultural Christianity in America is the norm. And actual biblical discipleship is the exception. Cultural Christianity, though, is the underlying reality of America. Every year, somewhere between 70 to 80% of people report that they identify religiously as Christians. In fact, many of them say they are active church attenders, yet you look at their behavior and it's virtually no different than people that say they're non-Christians or even don't have any religious affiliation. There's been extensive research to show this to be the case. David Kinnaman, in his book, Unchristian, that was published by the Barna Institute, did extensive research, and they found that while 3 out of 4 people in America consider themselves Christian, with half of them calling themselves born-again Christians, their lifestyles of those polled, their activities of their behavior of life, were statistically equivalent to non-Christians in the survey. In other words, when asked, those that self-identified as Christians were just as likely on this poll to watch pornography, to consult a psychic, to physically fight or abuse others, to get drunk, use illegal drugs, tell lies, and seek revenge. This is the epidemic of cultural Christianity. Self-identifying for social reasons as a Christian and yet making no real attempt to emulate your life after the behavior of Jesus, the Jesus life. And I would say that's a scandal in America, and in particular in the so-called Bible Belt. That is a scandal. Too often, Christianity is a kind of social club where people are part of churches for the wrong reasons. And it's an epidemic. So how did we get here? How did we get to a place where this is the reality of the religious landscape around us? I would say how we got there is that the American church, as we know it, used a man-made system of evangelism that certainly at best didn't work, and at worst it's unbiblical. I want you to track with me on this. And listen to me closely so you don't misunderstand. How did we get there? In the first place, we have tended to use evangelism, an evangelistic method that focuses on making believers, not on making disciples. We have engaged in massive door-knocking campaigns, and I speak broadly now, outside of even our fellowship, just Christendom at large. We have been involved in revival events and campaigns and crusades, trying to get people to pray Jesus into their heart or even get baptized. The goal was to see how many people we could convert into believing in Jesus with little or no coaching for discipleship. And so the result has been lots of people who identify in their religious affiliation as Christians by belief, but they don't live as disciples in their behavior. Secondly, how did we get there? Our evangelism methods have been primarily centered at the church building. We have tried to invite people to the building with all kinds of appealing seeker-sensitive services and events to try to get people here to the building to hear a message or to be a part of a program. And the goal was to get as many people into our building as possible, to expose them to a Christian message or to a Christian atmosphere. And while that may not be a bad thing in and of itself, the result has been this. Let's be honest. We have trained people to come to the church building to be a consumer. Come to the building and we'll give you something. Come to the building and you'll get something from us. And we've trained people to be consumers looking for how the church can serve them and never really teaching them how to be servants themselves, like we sang about tonight. Real disciples say, Lord, make me a servant. Thirdly, how did we get there? Evangelism became essentially denominational competition. In cultural Christianity, a person's allegiance is really more tied to their church, the church they attend, more so than a living relationship with Jesus. It's almost like politics, but on the religious scene, where people blindly identify as a Methodist, a Baptist, a Presbyterian, or Church of Christ because that's the team they've always played for religiously. And so evangelism focuses on trying to get people to change teams and come over to my church with very little discussion about a personal walk with Jesus. The result has been lots of religious arguments, lots of debates, that have burned bridges of relationship and have alienated people from one another and have completely almost destroyed any influence we might have for actually making people a disciple of Jesus. You see, there's a drastic difference between a cultural Christian and a disciple of Jesus. I want to share with you a little chart here that kind of illustrates the difference. A cultural Christian says, I believe in Jesus. A disciple of Jesus says, I truly trust and follow Him, and they really do. A cultural Christian says, I sing to Jesus, but a disciple of Jesus says, I surrender to Jesus. A cultural Christian may applaud Jesus and may applaud things that are Christian, and yet a disciple of Jesus actually participates in Jesus' mission. A cultural Christian says, I maintain a safe, really by practice, they maintain a safe distance from Jesus. A disciple of Jesus says, I want to get as close to Jesus as I possibly can. A cultural Christian says, well, I study about Jesus, but really in their life they remain unchanged. But a disciple of Jesus works hard to follow after Jesus in His teaching and experiences deep transformation of life. A cultural Christian uses Jesus to fulfill their personal agenda. Give me some Jesus, a little sprinkle of Jesus, because, I need a little bit of blessing from above. But a disciple of Jesus is willing to throw themselves completely into Jesus' mission. A cultural Christian is very fluent in religious language. A disciple of Jesus says, I'm more concerned about who people are before God than how they sound. And so you see, there's a drastic difference between the two. Well, the way that we have tended to do church many times in America is really very conducive to the outcome that we've gotten. Here's just a basic rule of thumb for life. This is true in your individual life, and it's true in groups of people. The system that you are using is perfectly designed for the results that you're getting. Your marriage is not going great. The way that you have arranged the system of your marriage is perfectly designed for the results you're getting. You don't have a good relationship with your coworkers, the system that you're using is perfectly designed for the results that you're getting. You're not real happy with your walk with Jesus, the system you're using is perfectly designed for the results you're getting. We're not happy with the cultural Christianity epidemic in our culture today, the system we're using is perfectly designed for those results. And so if you're not happy with the results, then you've got to look hard at, maybe we need to change the system. We've created a perfect system for creating cultural Christians. And we maybe not have focused so well on creating a system of making disciples of Jesus. And let me show you what I mean by that. Classroom discipleship creates cultural Christians, while making disciples of Jesus really happens through intentional relationships. Let me show you the difference. This is a little bit of an oversimplification, but I'm trying to make a point here, and I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. I'll try to clarify a little bit after the chart. But classroom discipleship basically studies the Bible as a textbook for doctrine. Intentional relational discipleship, you say, what does that mean? We'll get there. In this series, I'm going to explore in depth what intentional relational discipleship is. But where you build relationships intentionally to try to bring somebody in maturity of Christ in their discipleship walk, it focuses on studying the Bible as a means to a personal relationship with Jesus. That's why I study the Bible. It's not necessarily to have all the right answers. I study the Bible to get closer to the author of this book. You see, I don't want to just know the word of the Lord. I want to know the word of the Lord for the purpose of coming to know the Lord of the Word. Classroom discipleship is aimed primarily at the head, while intentional relational discipleship is aimed at the head, the heart, and the hands. Classroom discipleship tends to be more academic, whereas intentional relational discipleship is focused on teaching and modeling and coaching. Apprenticeship, like we talked about this morning. Classroom discipleship tends to focus more on emphasizing factual knowledge, whereas intentional relationships for discipleship emphasize on life application. How am I going to live out the Bible? Not just know the Bible, but live the Bible. Classroom discipleship, really the goal is about information exchange. I got to get the lesson across to you. I got to get this information across to you. Whereas in intentional relational discipleship, the goal is the transformation of a life. In classroom discipleship, you're teaching the Bible to people, and in relationships that are intentional for discipleship, you're teaching people the Bible. And there's a big difference between those two. In classroom discipleship, you got a start time, a stop time. It's very quick. You're watching the clock. But in a relationship, you're investing in somebody's life. That may mean you're in their home frequently, even daily at times, and it takes time to develop that and to pour into someone. In classroom discipleship, you're just coming into a classroom expecting the teacher to have all the answers, but in a relationship for discipleship, you're saying, hey, let's study together and let's figure it out together. Classroom discipleship happens more in a large group. Intentional relationship discipleship happens more in a small group. Classroom discipleship is primarily aimed at numerical growth. But if you're in an intentional relationship with somebody for discipleship, your aim is spiritual growth. The lesson is the agenda in the classroom. Doing life together is the agenda when you're investing in a relationship for discipleship. It's more formal in the classroom, more casual in relationship. Now, I'm going to go to that next chart in just a minute. Now, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I am not saying we don't need to have Bible classes. I'm not saying there's not a place for instruction in a classroom setting. I'm simply saying we cannot depend on that to make disciples. We need something else. I like this chart a lot. This chart demonstrates to us a relational community that is on mission, the mission of making disciples for Jesus. At the top of the cone, you've got what might be called Jesus' public discipleship. This is when Jesus, you see over here, it's kind of small, over here to the top, Jesus the public teacher. Jesus often was engaged in public teaching, public discipleship. You think about the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain. Jesus is preaching and teaching to large groups of people. But you come on down the cone, it becomes more concentrated, and you have social discipleship. This is, for instance, when Jesus had deep relationships with some individuals like at Bethany, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and He's investing in them in a more of a social context. And there's more intimacy there, more than just the large crowd, and He's investing in people in a social way. You come on down the cone and you see personal discipleship. For instance, Jesus specifically chose, of all the people that listened to His teaching, He identified 12 men that He would pour into in personal discipleship training. And then we come on down the cone, you see what might be called transparent discipleship. Even among those 12, Jesus said, you know, I'm going to choose 3. We call them the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. There are 3 times in Scripture that Jesus just went with those 3 men only. I think Jesus identified of His 12 apostles 3 that showed particular promise in spiritual leadership capabilities. And we see that He poured into them. Peter becomes the one to preach the first gospel sermon. James becomes a leader in the early church in Jerusalem. John writes the last book of the Bible and receives the revelation on the Isle of Patmos. Jesus identifies those 3 men, and He invests even deeper in them, in training them in transparent discipleship. And all of that filters down into what might be called Holy Spirit discipleship, where Jesus is in a deep relationship with His Heavenly Father. Each one of these is connected to the next. And I think as a church, we need each one of these. We need public discipleship. This happens generally in our worship gatherings, large gatherings. We need Bible classes. That's where more social discipleship occurs. Then we need more small group gatherings, small group Bible studies, smaller gatherings where just a few people, maybe anywhere from 12 to 15, get together to talk about the Bible and talk about deeper levels of following Jesus. And then I would also suggest the idea of even bringing it on down, just like Jesus had His Peter, James, and John, maybe you need to be involved in a discipleship group. Now, what is a discipleship group, you say? Well, I think that's what Jesus had with Peter, James, and John. And I'll talk more about that in a coming lesson, exactly what that looks like. Entering into a very intentional relationship with a few other people for the purpose of growing intentionally in a relational way in your discipleship. And then that all comes down to your personal walk and relationship with God. So, how are we going to get this done? The way that we have been doing church, by and large in America, has produced a lot of cultural Christians. We've not been as intentional, I think, in a lot of places. Now, we've done it well in some places, let me admit, but there's sometimes that we've not really focused in on making, handcrafting, apprenticing disciples of Jesus. And if that is the case, you may disagree with that, okay? And we'll be friends if you think differently. But I just want to say, if there's any validity to what I just said, any at all, it's time to change the system. It's time to go back to Jesus' organic way of making disciples. We need what Jim Putman in his book calls a disciple shift. If we're going to start making more disciples, we may have to fundamentally change the way we've been doing church. We need fewer cultural Christians, and we need more disciples of Jesus. We need the kind of change that we as a fellowship have said we're committed to, and that is restoration. We should be willing to always be evaluating our practices and our methods and say, let's always say we don't have it figured out, but we can know that who does? Jesus does. He's got the perfect method. Let's go back and examine His method. Not only His message, but His method of making disciples. Jesus poured into people and made disciples through intentional relationships in smaller group settings And then once He'd made them into disciples, He sent them out to go do the same thing. And only disciples can do that. Only disciples can make disciples. It's a fundamental truth of life, is it not, that everything produces after its own kind? I mean, if you have a garden and you go down to the local hardware store, the co-op or somewhere, and you buy some corn seed and you plant it in a row in your garden, don't come to me griping when you don't harvest any watermelons. Because corn produces after its kind. You plant a corn seed, you get corn. You plant watermelon seeds, you get watermelons. But if you plant cultural Christians, don't expect to get disciples. You plant cultural Christians, you'll get cultural Christians. But if you plant disciples, if you make disciples, you'll get disciples of Jesus. And only disciples of Jesus can make other disciples. You can only make disciples if you yourself have truly apprenticed yourself to the Jesus life. So it starts with becoming a disciple yourself. How can you move from being a cultural Christian to a disciple of Jesus? It starts by making the decision to go all in into the Jesus life. And I'll just say, I don't know hardly any of you, but I know in a crowd this size that some of you have never really gone all in to Jesus. You haven't. You've dabbled. You've never really plunged your whole life. G.K. Chesterton famously wrote these words: "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." Now, why is the Christian life difficult? As we saw this morning, because being a disciple of Jesus means you must deny yourself and die to yourself. Now, in reality, the Christian life, Jesus would say, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." So it's not really that difficult living the Christian life. What is difficult is the choice to enter the Christ life by dying to self. That's the hard part. It's like skydiving. Once you're out of the plane, it's relatively easy. It's stepping out that's hard. When you got to make that choice to give up your life and fully go all in to the Jesus life. When you fully give your life to the Lord and you enter into an intimate relationship with Him, do you know what intimate relationship almost always brings? Now, there's exceptions to this, but most of the time, if everything is the natural progress of things, when two people enter into an intimate relationship with one another, the intimacy of relationship results in reproduction. A man and a woman enter into an intimate relationship in marriage, the result is reproduction. Well, if you enter into an intimate relationship with God, the result should be the reproduction of making more disciples. By definition, disciples make disciples. There's no shortcut to making disciples. It requires a time investment of investing in the lives of other people. That's what it absolutely takes, is an investment. Let me share with you the truthfulness of this. The Apostle Paul followed the example of Jesus himself. Just like we talked about this morning, what did Jesus do? Look at Jesus' method of making disciples. He hand-chose 12 men, poured himself into them for 3 years, and then after making them disciples, he said, "Now you go and make disciples too. You go do the same thing, follow my method, and you go choose some people and pour into them and make them into disciples, who then also go make disciples." Paul followed this example. Listen to the language Paul uses when he talks about and describes himself like being a spiritual parent. In 2 Timothy 3, verses 10 through 14, he says to Timothy, "You, however, have followed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, my persecutions and sufferings. Continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it." Paul is telling Timothy, you saw this in me. You were with me. Emulate that. Paul also wrote to the church at Philippi in Philippians 4 and verse 9 and said, "What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things." He wrote to a group of Christians at Thessalonica in 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 8 and said, "So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you have become very dear to us." You see, Paul didn't just simply lead a Sunday school class once a week or preach a sermon to a large crowd and then end it there. He focused on doing life with the people he was trying to disciple. In the Bible, relationships are the context and the environment for disciple making and discipleship. So if you're going to move from being a cultural Christian and into a disciple who makes disciples of Jesus, you must choose to put the highest priority on the relationship of others around you. You must decide to deny your self-centeredness, to deny your own selfish ways, and decide to be outward focused and pouring into the relationships of people around you. Jesus makes true disciples into fishers of people. As we draw this to a close, we want to look at Luke chapter 5. And before we do that, I read a quote a few weeks ago, and this author made this statement, and when I first read it, I was a little taken back by it, and you might be too, okay? So I'm just going to warn you. But I think he's onto something. He said, "I do not mourn the death of Christendom. I welcome her demise, for she has denigrated, lowered, and watered down true Christianity." People say, as going back to the beginning of the sermon tonight, some people say, are we witnessing the death of Christianity in America? I say that if what we are witnessing is the death of cultural Christianity, I say to that, amen. She couldn't die soon enough. Because what we need is a resurgence of true biblical discipleship. In Luke chapter 5, Jesus, of course, he's here by the Sea of Gennesaret, the Lake of Gennesaret, the Sea of Galilee. And we see that there are two boats by the lake. The fishermen have gone out of the boats. They're now washing their nets. He gets into one of the boats, who's Simon's boat, and he tells him, he says, "Put out a little from the land." And he begins to teach the people from the boat, and after he finished speaking, he says, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." Now I want you to imagine how shocking this would have been for Peter. Peter is a professional fisherman. That's what he does for a living. He's done it since he was a boy. That's all he knows. He knows the best places to fish. He knows the best methods in order to catch fish. He's done it all the right ways. He's gone when you should go fishing, and he's fished all night, and he says, "I've fished all night, we've caught nothing, nothing." And Jesus says, "Put out and let down your nets for a catch." I'm sure there's a little bit of Peter, knowing Peter, how we do in Scripture, there's a little bit of Peter that probably was a little taken aback and maybe even a little offended by this carpenter telling a professional fisherman what he ought to do to catch fish. But he says, "Master," verse 5, "we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word I will let down the nets." Now I want you to notice what Peter says. He says, "We toiled all the night and took nothing." The way he had been trying to catch fish, he had worked really hard at it, but he had caught nothing. And Jesus says, you need to change your method. Cast the nets to the other side. And when he listened to the instructions of Jesus and what Jesus said about a method for fishing, they enclosed so many fish, the nets began to break, and they had to call for backup to get all those fish to shore. I think what we learn from this story, and by the way, Jesus goes on to say, after Peter is overwhelmed by the miraculous catch, he says, "Depart from me, I'm a sinful man, O Lord." They're astonished at the catch of fish. And he looks at him and he says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. This is verse number 20, or verse number 10 rather. Don't be afraid. From now on you'll be catching people. I think what we see from this story is we need to stop trying to catch fish with methods that aren't working. And we need to be willing to change and adopt to Jesus' method of fishing. Cast your nets to the other side. Now Jesus says to him then in verse 10, don't be afraid to do that. From now on you'll be catching people. From now on. If you listen to my way of casting the net, if you'll listen to my instructions for how to catch them, from now on you'll be catching people. So we must not, church, we must not be afraid to leave what is comfortable. We must not be afraid to leave methods that we're so accustomed to doing. We must be willing to take the leap and embrace Jesus' method of making disciples. Be willing to embrace investing in people intentionally in relationships for the purpose of discipleship. We must be willing to take the leap and embrace true discipleship, and we must not be afraid, if we need to fundamentally change the way we've been doing things to restore Jesus' mission, because His mission is the main thing. Like I said this morning, you can do everything else right, but if we don't make disciples, we lost. But if you can do nothing else and make disciples, and we won. It's time to leave the nets and start fishing for people. I hope that you'll come back for this series of lessons, because tomorrow night we're going to explore the idea of what it means to be a disciple maker. We're going to start getting into some nuts and bolts now that we've been challenged from Scripture of what our mission is to go make disciples. We're going to start looking at nuts and bolts. And first we're going to look tomorrow night at how that disciple makers are involved in coaching other people in spiritual growth. How do you coach someone in their spiritual growth? That's what we're going to explore. And then on Tuesday night, we're going to explore together exactly what was Jesus' method for making disciples. I want to leave you with this as a teaser for that lesson. I am absolutely convinced that the only way that you can be saved is through Jesus' message. The message of Jesus is perfect, but not only is His message perfect for making disciples, I'm convinced that His method of making disciples is perfect too. What was His method? Let's go back and look at it and try to restore it and explore it together on Tuesday night. And then we'll wrap up with an inspirational lesson on Wednesday night about sharing Jesus. And we're going to look at a story in the Gospels and just really walk down through that story and see that sharing Jesus may look completely different than what you thought it looked like. Let's be honest, for a lot of us, the reason we've not been sharing Jesus and making disciples is because we feel like we're not ready, we don't know enough, or somehow we're not equipped. We're going to see a story from Jesus' interaction with someone in the Gospels that shows that you are ready right now, and God has given you everything you need right now to share Jesus with somebody. And so we'll end with that really inspirational call to go share Jesus with those around us. Tonight, maybe you're here because someone cared about you and has invested in you in a relationship. And they said, hey, come go with me to church. And the reason they invited you is because they're investing in you in a relationship. And so I'm so thankful that somebody loved you enough to pour into you. And I pray that you'll continue to do that. But tonight, you may have had some questions. And so if the lesson has brought some questions, then I would say if a friend brought you, then start having some conversation after you leave tonight and talk some more about it and explore what does it really mean to be a disciple, and go and explore that some more and study some more. I want to challenge you to do that. Or maybe tonight you're here because nobody invited you, you just happened to show up and you're like, well, I want to know some more. I'd love to talk to you in the foyer or point you to some good believers here, some disciples here that would love to invest in you and share some more with you and study with you and look more at what Jesus says real discipleship is about. If we can help you in those ways, if you need prayers of encouragement, we'd encourage you to let us know how we can help you as we all stand together and as we sing.